Now, in order to conceptualize terrorism a little bit further and to draw some useful distinctions, we can think of two distinctive dimensions within which terrorism can be expressed or that can be developed. A first of these is the instrumental dimension. The instrumental dimension really would correspond to acts of aggression that are calculated, rationally motivated, deployed strategically towards the attainment of a specific limited objective. On the other hand, we would have expressive forms of terrorism that emphasize the symbolic, performative dimension of violence and are only really loosely tied to broad inspirational goals. So let's take the first of these. This really implies thinking about terrorism as following a strategic logic. And I think that's an important way to think about terrorism, because sometimes terrorism is a little too hastily understood as an irrational, impulsive form of violence that has no sense or reason. Instead, we can of course think of terrorism as a weapon or tactic among others, and that is deployed in a very purposeful and calculated fashion by actors. Martha Crenshaw, for instance, explains that terrorism is ultimately a form of political behavior resulting from the deliberate choice of a basically rational actor. And indeed, when you look at various studies of individual terrorists, they are most of the time found to be perfectly rational individuals and not psychopathic or otherwise disturbed. In this view, therefore, terrorism is merely another means to a particular end. It is the use of violence to attain a particular goal, and it is one tool within a wider arsenal of means. Here we really are within the domain of Clausewitz. Clausewitz again tells us that war is an extension of policy. We use war insofar as it serves the policy that we have. When it becomes counterproductive, we refrain from using it. At least that's the policy, rational end of war, that dimension of the Trinity. And so we can think of terrorism in the same way, that groups use terrorism because they decide, reason, rightly or wrongly, that it will serve their goals, and so long as it does, they will pursue it. We can see this quite clearly when we think about a number of groups that have been associated with terrorism. So we can think of the IRA, the Basque ETA group, the Palestinian PLO, the Kurdish PKK, the Palestinian Hamas or Lebanese Hezbollah. These are all organizations that have quite clear limited demands. They all seek some form of control over certain territories. They tend to be locally implanted and supported, and crucially, they use terrorism as part of a wider span of policies. Most of these organizations have sought to use other political channels, for instance, to be elected, to gain representation, to use non-violent means to advance their objectives. And their use of terrorism has not been consistent and continuous. It's come through peaks and troughs, and at times is in fact entirely relinquished. For example, the Irish Republican movement has today completely relinquished terrorism, but even though it still pursues, of course, its goal of a unified Ireland. I mean, even suicide terrorism, which might seem like the more irrational end of terrorism, can be understood in these terms. In fact, the suicide bomber can also be reasoned as a tactic, as a cheap, self-guided missile, effectively. motivations of the individual suicide bomber would need to be probed. From the point of view of the organization, you can see why suicide bombing might have its appeal. We see here in a quote from Ahmad Yassin, the founder of the Hamas, this kind of reasoning. Once we have warplanes and missiles, he says, then we can think of changing our means of legitimate self-defense. Right now, we can only tackle the fire with our bare hands and sacrifice ourselves. In other words, terrorism, suicide bombing is a technique available, a tactic available to weaker groups who cannot count on large armies, on sophisticated technology, and so forth, therefore have to resort to different means. But fundamentally, yes, this is Yassin's claim, these organizations are no different from states or from their adversaries in terms of seeking to defend themselves and using force in a calculated fashion. Suicide terrorism, in fact, isn't inherently religious. That's to say that it doesn't necessarily require faith in an afterworld. One of the keenest practitioners of suicide terrorism have been the liberation tigers of the Tamil Eelam, the Sri Lankan Marxist-Leninist organization, so not a religious organization. And yet between 1980 and 2000, they were responsible for 60% of the suicide attacks worldwide. In fact, suicide attacks can often be seen to be part of campaigns. And Robert Pate has conducted a study on this and showed that every suicide campaign from 1980 to 2001 had as a major objective the coercing of a foreign government to get military forces out of a perceived homeland. And in this accompanying slide, you can see how suicide attacks operate through forms of campaigns. They come in bunches as part of a continuous, as attacks for a period of time that are then foregone later on. Hamas, in particular, used intensely suicide attacks in the early 2000s and has all but ceased to use them for the last 15 years or so. So it's not as if Hamas is inherently an organization that carries out suicide attacks, simply chosen to do so at a particular time in its history. So to sum up really with the instrumental dimension, it's really a way of thinking about terrorism as something like a form of asymmetric warfare. Terrorism is here a weapon of the weak. It's a resort by organizations with limited resources, facing much more powerful adversaries who use the means of terrorism because it's quite a lot of bang for buck. You don't need a lot of resources or a lot of personnel in order to cause significant carnage. You can use the media to amplify the attacks and draw attention to your campaigns. But ultimately, terrorism is still really a means to an end. And when that terrorism becomes deemed counterproductive, it's likely to be abandoned. Now, on the other hand, when we think about the expressive dimension of terrorism, we are looking at a rather different modality of violence, one that is guided much less by limited goals and by a kind of ends means rationale. Mark Jugendsmeyer has written about religious terrorism along the following lines, when he says that these creations of terror are done not to achieve a strategic goal, but to make a symbolic statement. They are intended to illustrate or refer to something beyond their immediate target, a grander conquest, for instance, or a struggle more awesome than meets the eye. Such explosive scenarios are not tactics directed towards an immediate earthly or strategic goal, but dramatic events intended to impress with their symbolic significance. So terrorism here, of course, is a kind of performative act. It's a symbolic statement, much more than a strategic gambit. There is much, I think, here to draw from, but a qualification as well, which is that we should not think of this way of thinking as being strictly religious, as Jugendsmeyer does. The reason for this, to think this anyway, is to refer back to the 19th century anarchists, if you want, the founders of modern terrorism, because these anarchists share many of this disposition towards expressive terrorism, and yet, of course, were generally radical atheists. In particular, anarchists coined the notion of the propaganda of the deed. The idea that the violent deed, would be its own message. And all of this was founded on an idea that expressive violence would ultimately be a way of inspiring the masses and catalyzing revolution, both through mobilizing the population, but also provoking retribution from the state that would intensify the conditions of oppression and, again, create the conditions for a popular revolution. What we find common to many of these anarchists is a belief in the radical transformative power of violence. So in a sense, there is a belief in something like a sacred violence. But again, this sacrality, this sacredness, should not be understood as necessarily inherently religious or strictly religious, but to have a much wider resonance. It's the early Italian socialist thinker Carlo Pisacane who coined this notion of the propaganda of the deed. In commenting on an attempt on the life of King Ferdinand of Naples by an Italian soldier, Milano, who attempted to bayonet the king in 1856. Pisacane, in the following year, explained that ideas spring from deeds and not the other way around. The flash of Milano's bayonet was a more effective propaganda than 1,000 volumes penned by doctrinarians. In a way, the sword or the bayonet is more powerful than the pen, Pisacane is telling us. The Russian Party of the Social Revolutionaries also believed that terrorism and political assassination could shake the masses from their slumber. It would, they said, awaken even the sleepiest Philistines, force them, even against their will, to think politically. The Russian Peter Kropotkin also believed that, and I quote, action which compels attention awakens the spirit of revolt. It breeds daring. Soon it becomes apparent that the established order has not the force once supposed. The people observe that the monster is not so terrible as they thought. So all of this is really an advocacy of the use of selective violence to shock people, to awaken them, to tear the veil from their eyes, to show that the status quo is much more fragile than is otherwise thought. And of course, this really, tantamount to believing that that violence can have this revelatory experience for its spectators. We find, therefore, what we might call a tradition of apocalyptic thinking among practitioners of terrorist violence. And bear in mind when we talk about apocalypse, it really does not only refer to the end of an old world, or narratives of apocalypse also see the beginning of a new world in or through the apocalypse. ISIS, notably, has a very strong expressive belief in a prophecy surrounding Dabiq, a town in northern Syria, in which it is believed that jihadists and crusaders will meet for an ultimate battles. In this ultimate battle, the crusaders are to be defeated, and with it will come the day of judgment. But again, this apocalypticism does not need to be explicitly religious. It exists in a variety of secular guises. And what is specifically modern about apocalyptic terrorism, whether it's perpetrated by secular or overtly religious groups, is that it is very distinctly believes in the power of human agency. That is to say, it thinks that humans have a role in bringing about the end of days. And that's quite distinct from pre-modern forms of apocalypticism, which typically thought that the end of the world was something that could only be known by God, and at best humans could try and read that mind by decrypting holy texts and so forth, but ultimately the day of the judgment was decided by God, and certainly not something that humans would have anything to do in bringing forth. Virtually all modern apocalyptic thinking tends to see a specific role in humans in precipitating or bringing about the apocalypse, including in a religious group like ISIS. Now, one of the rationales advanced by anarchists and other perpetrators of expressive terrorism is that if you attack a regime, it will be forced to respond through savage repression, that it will therefore show its true face. People will see what the regime really is like when you put its back against a wall, and this in turn will bring new sympathizers to the revolutionary cause. So terror therefore will be a means to draw the battle lines between sides, to force bystanders to choose one. Now, this of course could be said to be a strategy, but one would have to recognize it's a highly speculative one, since it leaves all the important decisions in the hands of the enemy. And so this is, again, quite typical of this expressive modality of violence, that it doesn't think in a very systematic and calculated fashion about attaining a particular goal. Moreover, it adopts a very grand millenarian goal that is to be brought about somewhat mysteriously through or at least assisted by the use of violence. So therefore, while all terrorism is by definition spectacular, expressive forms seek especially symbolic targets to convey their messages. The British writer Joseph Conrad captures some of this idea in his novel from 1907, The Secret Agent, a novel that's based on a real attempt to bomb the Greenwich Observatory here in London. In the novel, the main character Verloc is recruited by Mr. Vladimir, the first secretary of the embassy of a foreign country. No prizes for guessing which country that is. What Mr. Vladimir explains to Verloc in the novel, when he is encouraging Verloc to conduct a terrorist attack, and when they discuss what the target of that attack should be, Vladimir reasons that, I quote, "A bomb outrage, to have any influence on the public opinion now, who's become so blasé with terrorism, must go beyond the intention of vengeance or terrorism. It must be purely destructive. It must be that, and only that, beyond the faintest suspicion of any other object. You anarchists should make it clear that you are perfectly determined to make a clean sweep of the whole social creation. But how to get that appallingly absurd notion into the heads of the middle classes, so that there should be no mistake? That's the question." And Vladimir concludes that really the idol of the day, the true symbolic target to be struck at, is science. Such an attack, he says, must have all the shocking senselessness of gratuitous blasphemy. And since bombs are your means of expression, it would be really telling if one could throw a bomb into pure mathematics. Given that that, of course, is an impossibility, Verloc and Vladimir settle for an attack on astronomy, and specifically on the prime meridian at the Greenwich Observatory. Perhaps unsurprisingly, The Secret Agent was reportedly the favourite book of the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, a brilliant mathematician who conducted an 18-year bombing campaign against scientific institutions in the United States. Kaczynski believed that technology was destroying the world and that science was guilty of this, and sent mail bombs to a variety of figures in the scientific establishment to convey this message and to articulate the view that science had to be, in many ways, renounced to save humanity. Existential commitment to a cause is a very important dimension, of course, within terrorism, and particularly within expressive forms of terrorism. And suicide terrorism, of course, is emblematic of this. But even where suicide terrorism is not part of terrorist operations, what we generally find is a strong willingness to accept self-sacrifice. Sergei Stepniak-Krasvinsky, a 19th century Russian anarchist, explained that the terrorist is noble, terrible, irresistibly fascinating, for he combines in himself the two sublimities of human grandeur, the martyr and the hero. From the day he swears in the depths of his heart to free the people and the country, he knows he is consecrated to death. He goes forth to meet it fearlessly and can die without flinching, not like a Christian of old, but like a warrior accustomed to look death in the face. So here we might recognize some of the existential dimensions of the warrior that we've discussed in the past, and certainly there's a very direct invocation of the warrior here.